Okay, welcome everybody. It's great to have everybody here today for the session. Congratulations on making it through to the end. If you have been with us all day, hopefully we'll give you a high point to finish on. We've got about 45 minutes today to talk to you about the ICO's Children's Code, and hopefully if you're with us, it's because you really want to get a good overview and introduction to the code itself and what it's all about. I'm Jo Pedder. I'm a head of domestic regulatory strategy working at the ICO, and I'm joined today by my colleague Jacob Orvig-Stott, who's a principal policy advisor in the same area of the ICO. And our lives at the moment are dominated by trying to deliver that implementation programme for the Children's Code. So we're quite close to this and happy to be sharing our knowledge and experience with you today. We've got some time for Q&A at the end of the session, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. I was also just going to note as a bit of a context setting exercise that 1 in 5 UK users of the internet is a child. And during the pandemic, obviously children have become ever more dependent on online services to stay connected and to learn and to play. We also know from some of the key advocates who lobbied for the code to be implemented that there are over 1 billion children online, about 170,000 go online for the first time each day, but the internet wasn't actually designed with children's needs in mind. It was largely designed by adults and for adults, and yet we know that children have particular needs and vulnerabilities that need to be recognised. And so what the code that we're going to be talking to you today about is trying to do is to not to block children from accessing services, but to recognise how vital those services are for children, and to put into practice the idea of children's data being protected automatically by design and by default. We really do want to support organisations to innovate and to be creative so that services can both protect and empower child users and also inspire greater confidence amongst them and their parents and guardians as well. Just moving on, hopefully, I'm not sure if everybody can see my slides. Can I get a bit of an Jacob, are people seeing this, do you think?
I've got the holding slide at the moment.
Yeah, I have as well. Okay. Could Matt or somebody move them on? Thank you.
I can do that, Jo, actually. I've got
control. Oh, great. Okay, thank you. So, yeah, I think we're on to the next one. Sorry, technical glitch. There we go. Thanks, Jacob. So in terms of the Children's Code, what is it? It's a code that's formally known as the Age Appropriate Design Code. It sets out 15 standards of age appropriate design for online services that process children's personal data. It's not new law. Its role is to articulate what the principles that are enshrined in UK data protection law, the Data Protection Act 2018 and the UK GDPR mean in practice for children's data. It's grounded in the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, and it aims to create an open and transparent and safer place for children to explore and play online. And we think that the framework of the UNCRC rights, which we were obliged to take into account when we did draft the code, provides assistance in services understanding what it really means to treat children's data fairly. And as I mentioned, sort of just in the introductory context setting remarks, was that the Commission was very clear, and it's included in the forward of the code, that we are trying to protect children in the digital world, not protect them from it. It covers lots of broad different types of service, and I think if you sorry, these slides are jumping around a bit. Right, the code's scope is that it applies to relevant information society services likely to be accessed by children, and by children we mean anybody who's under the age of 18. So it is really broad and covers a diverse range of services. The formal definition is that it's an information society service is one that is any service normally provided for remuneration at a distance by electronic means and at the individual request of the recipient of the service. In practice, that means that it's likely to cover a wide range of apps, online games, educational websites and streaming services. So it really is quite a broad scope. And in legal terms, it's drafted in a way that really tries to reflect where children are online, rather than just covering services that are intended for them or directed to them. And so it's trying to make sure that there aren't any gaps there really, and that might leave children or their data unprotected. I think the likely to be access definition really was deliberately introduced by UK Parliament just to make sure that there really was that complete coverage. What we have clarified though during the development of the code is that this doesn't mean that the requirements apply to any service that a child could conceivably access. It does have to have a more probable than not chance that a child would be wanting to try to access a service before the code applies. But the overarching message we tend to give is that if you think that children are interested in the service that you supply, you think that they might well be using it, then you're probably going to be covered. And there are just a few narrow exemptions that are there in practice that carve you out, but that tends to be for counselling services, some public authority services, or websites that just provide information about bricks and mortar services like shops and things that can where a child would be accessing the service in person. So as I say, if you think that you're covered and you provide services remotely, then you probably will be. Let me jump on to the next slide. Thank you. So what role does the code play in law? Well, the code, as I've said, is rooted in existing data protection laws. It was introduced by the Data Protection Act, so that's what gave the Commissioner the requirement to create it. It's in some areas the standards quite literally translate what's required. So the transparency standard explains what services need to do to make sure that the information they're providing users with about what's happening to their data is clear and concise, and that it's in a manner that children can genuinely engage with. Other standards are a bit more conceptual and general. So things like the best interest of the child is a more conceptual thing that applies throughout all of the requirements. The code's on a statutory footing, which means that both the ICO and the courts have to take it into account as far as it's relevant when we're carrying out any supervisory activity. So in the event of a complaint or an investigation, it would be our sort of first port of call where issues relating to children's data in an online service context apply. And I think we've said consistently that if you're not conformant with the code, then it's unlikely that you'd be able to demonstrate that the processing of children's data that you're undertaking is fair, or that it complies with the underlying data protection requirements. And we have a range of tools that we are able to use in the scenario where we find areas of concern. But at the moment, the message we're trying to give is that we recognise we're in a transition period. We're really encouraging services to engage with the code, engage with events like this, and with the resources that we're putting out to support, and to work out what you need to do and to take steps to bring those services into conformance. And we'll continue to offer that support, and that's what we'll be looking for in the first instance. Thanks. Just a word really on the timelines. So back in July 2020, we created an impact assessment which looked at how the codes was likely to impact economically. We then submitted the code for its sort of relevant parliamentary scrutiny process back in 21st of July. And it successfully completed the passage of that and that process, and came into force with a 12-month transition period on the 2nd of September 2020. And that period, that 12 months period, ends 2nd of September this year, so just past the sort of halfway point. And then looking to the future, we also committed to carrying out a review of the code and of the resources that we've developed to support it and to support organisations, and that will start 12 months after the end of the transition period. So from autumn 2020, we'll be looking to pull together evidence and look at the impact it's had and whether it's meeting the objectives that we were hoping for. And then just a word on sort of the bigger picture. So the code is complementary to but distinct from the wider government plans on online harms regulations. So many of you will likely be aware that the government announced its intention to introduce an online safety bill to bring the plans for an online harms regime and a duty of care into fruition in the UK in legislation. So we see it as a kind of complementary and piece and a significant piece of the jigsaw, but we recognise it's not the whole gambit. Whilst the code is focused on children's data and data-enabled risks, the online harms regime will have a broader, wider focus on ensuring that services treat children and other users with appropriate care. And the ICO has been instrumental in working with other regulatory partners to establish the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, and we're using that as a vehicle for trying to ensure regulatory coherence as we go forward with requirements of that online harms regime and in Ofcom's case the video sharing platform regulations right now, and we're considering what kind of joint guidance and support we can provide on an ongoing basis, because we take on board feedback that we've had around the importance of that sort of regulatory cohesiveness. A brief note on Brexit, so not going to go into a lot of detail here, but the main thing to note is that now post the Brexit transition period, whether you're established in or outside of the EEA, if you monitor or target users in the UK, then this will apply. And it's also worth stressing, I think, that this is explicitly recognised in the code, that whilst the scope of the code itself is very broad, the ICO remains very much committed to its risk-based and proportionate approach. So we're not expecting every company to make root and branch reforms across all of their activities once the transition period ends. And we recognise that different services pose different risks, and we will, in our own activity, focus on the areas of highest risk, either informed by the severity of what's going on in the processing and the number of stakeholders and users, and we'll be proportionate and expect people to act reasonably, and we'll take into account the sort of resources that they have at their disposal in doing so. Thanks. Jacob's going to talk about the specific standards in a moment, but I think it's just worth recognising sort of more broadly that the standards are deliberately designed to be quite flexible, not too prescriptive or granular, and I think this recognises the breadth of services that are within scope and the different risks and benefits that go on within that, and the different types of processing activities. And it is also, as I've mentioned before, sort of risk-based. So as an example, the age appropriate application standard says that the level of certainty that services should have about the age of a child user should be proportionate to the risks that the data processing poses. And so the implications of this is that not all services need to do sort of full verification, and we're expecting a sort of common sense approach, and we'll take that sort of risk-based and proportionate approach ourselves. And then the standards are quite interlinked, and they clarify and build on each other. So transparency sort of sets out what the general requirements for how to explain what's going on in the service, but it links into some of the more specific detail on profiling and data sharing. And finally, I think worth noting that there's the 15 standards themselves within the code and the guidance that goes alongside those, but we've also got within the body of the document or the resource some annexes that go into a little bit more detail about some of the technical issues around the scope and how to determine whether you're in or out age ranges and development needs, and what we see as a sort of starting point for that. Some more detail on lawful bases for processing, and there is also within that the annex is a a template that's not mandatory, but a template for DPIAs that you could choose to use when you're starting to interrogate your service and think about what to do for the code. So I'm going to pass over to Jacob, who's going to take you on a bit more of a deep dive on some of the standards themselves. Thanks.
Thanks, Jo, and good afternoon, everyone, as well. I feel obliged to inform you that there is a large and rather rowdy group of Venezuelan protesters outside our London office at the moment, so apologies in advance if the sounds they're making get louder than the sounds I'm making, but fingers crossed they won't do. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about the code standards, and as Jo mentioned, the 15 standards within the codes are flexible and they're mutually supportive. So collectively, we hope that they're greater than the sum of their parts. I've loosely grouped these 15 standards into 3 overarching thematic areas that make sense to me. So they're not sort of formally presented as such within the code, but I think it's a helpful way to conceptualize them, and it's also a helpful way to understand how they do this interlinking between the sort of different groups and between the standards. I don't want to overwhelm you with too much detail, and I also want to leave sort of plenty of time for discussion. So for each standard, I've tried to boil them down into a one-line summary of what the standard ultimately aims to achieve. So to start with the bucket around core principles, these all set out the fundamentals for online services that fall under the scope of the code, and they're a combination of things that are kind of non-negotiable in data protection law terms and sort of guiding stars, I guess, if you like. And so to start with the first standard, the best interest of a child, as Jo touched upon, this outlines the role of the UNCRC and how services should weigh up the impacts of what they do with children's data on their fundamental rights. And this is all in the service of ensuring that ultimately online services treat the best interests of the child as a primary concern. The standard that follows that, data protection impact assessment, essentially says that all organisations that fall under the scope of the code are obliged to complete this DPIA. So the DPIA is a cornerstone of data protection compliance, and it's an important process for anticipating and mitigating any risks to children that might arise from your services. And also it's an important thing in demonstrating to us as a regulator that you're taking your data protection obligations seriously, and it's a way to document how you're doing so. Moving on to the third standard, age appropriate application is all about ensuring that online services that fall under the scope of the code account for the needs of children across different age ranges and ensuring that the services are age appropriate, as it says in the title. Detrimental use of data plays into this. So this says that detrimental use of data isn't allowed. So you can't use data in ways that have been demonstrably shown to be harmful to children. I think it's important here to note that detrimental to wellbeing isn't defined by us. That's not our sort of core remit as a data regulator. What it does say is that where data is used in ways that might contravene other regulators' guidance, it will contravene the code. So a common example here might, for example, be targeted advertising. If this targeted advertising breaches others' health regulations, for example, by promoting alcohol, then it would consequently be seen in quite a dim light in the context of the detrimental use standard. Moving on to the last standard in this core principles area, this one is data minimization. So this one is quite simple in its essence. It's a principle that obviously exists in wider data protection law, and what it says is that you should only gather the data that you need to provide individual elements of a service. You can't gather, excess data just in case it might be needed later on. Moving on to the second overarching area of service design. Service design plays quite an important role in the code, and I think this is actually quite a good area that shows how and where the different standards interlink and support each other. So the transparency standard, the fourth standard in the code, is something that runs across all of the other standards within this service design category, and I'll explain how in a sec. So the transparency standard itself says that privacy information that's provided to child users should be clear, should be accessible, it should be prominent. We can see what this means in practice across other standards, including geolocation. So the geolocation standard says that where geolocation tracking is used, you need to tell children when and how it's active, and then switch it off again when it's not. And importantly as well, and this speaks to the data minimization standard, geolocation should be switched to off by default unless it's core to the service. Parental controls, the next standard in this area. This one is actually where there's potentially a risk of misinterpretation. So taking the phrase parental controls at face value, you might reasonably think this is about sort of ensuring that parents do have control of how a child uses its service. I think it would be helpful to clarify that actually the scope of the parental control standard in the code is a lot narrower than that. So what this standard does is it clarifies the importance of respecting children's privacy when parental controls are active. So similar to geolocation, it's about ensuring that there's transparency and good communication with child users where parental controls are being used. Moving on to nudge techniques, this can be boiled down to not using privacy eroding nudges. You shouldn't use design features that are designed intentionally to encourage children to give up more data than they should do otherwise. This standard does also talk about what a nudge technique actually means and what it might look like. So it includes, for example, presenting one option more prominently than another, perhaps a massive yes button for giving away data and then a tiny no button in the bottom right of the screen or something like that. And it also talks about framing of language and ensuring that the language of privacy choices is neutral. So again, you shouldn't, for example, say, yes, I do want to give my data up to have an amazing experience. No, I don't want to give my data up because I'm boring and want a standard experience. You should be presenting these choices in a neutral manner and thinking about whether what you're doing ultimately does or does not cause a privacy eroding nudge. Lastly, on the online tools standards, here this says that tools for exercising children's data rights must be accessible, tailored and prominent, i.e. these tools must deliver the vision of the transparency standards. So another overlap there. When we talk about data rights, these are the data rights that exist in wider data protection law. So there are 7 distinct ones. I won't go into sort of too much detail here, but these are things around the rights to accuracy, ensuring the data held about you is accurate, the right to erasure, having your data removed if you so choose, the right to ensure you can access a copy of your data, things like that. So here, the code clarifies what the tools should look like and how they should be designed for exercising the data rights. Moving on to our final area of data processing, starting with the policies and community standards standard. This is all about doing what you say you do. If you don't, we might find it difficult to say that the consent given is fair. Children and parents may not have agreed to give up their data had they known that the risks to them are actually sort of greater than the T's and C's say, things like that. It's all about ensuring that the transparency standard, again, is applied to your policies and community standards and ensuring that parents and children's expectations of your service live up to reality. Secondly, default settings. This is all about ensuring non-core children's data processing is set to off by default. And by privacy settings here, it talks about how this refers to settings relating to how your service uses data, but also settings relating to how third parties may use children's data. And then lastly, settings that pertain to how children's data may be shared with other users also. Standard 9, data sharing. Here, this sort of clarifies and re-emphasizes, I guess, that online services should have a compelling reason, really, to be sharing children's data, ultimately in the best interest of the child. And the standard does actually refer to our wider data sharing guidance for details on how you might approach this question and how you might go about managing your data sharing if you do share data with third parties. Profiling, standard 12. This is actually one of the more detailed standards in the code. It briefly sort of outlines what profiling is. So, using children's data to characterize or make judgments and predictions about them, for example. And then it also goes into detail about how to use website cookies in particular. And it also refers to external guidance to look at in the context of using profiling for advertising and content delivery. So alongside all of that sort of specific content, what the standard also says is that if you are going to do profiling, it should be only with appropriate safeguards, and where it's non-essential, it should be switched to off by default. Last but not least, the connected toys and devices standard. This was actually explicitly raised and during the consultation, and then also included in the code, because the scope for such devices to collect and process personal data, via functions such as cameras and microphones is quite considerable. And we also felt that these devices are often used by sort of multiple people across different age groups, particularly in a family setting. And there's also sort of particular nuances around how to deliver privacy information via a sort of physical device rather than a screen-based product. And so for all of those reasons, we felt like it warranted an explicit standard. And the headline for this standard is that if you are developing a connected toy and device, you need to be clear about the responsibilities of different people across the network and avoid passive data collection. So that was a whistle-stop tour through the 15 code standards. I'm just going to briefly wrap up on some steps to take now, because I think that'd be helpful for people. So we are over halfway through the code transition period, and many organisations have made significant progress with the code. But in the spirit of this being a sort of general refresher webinar, we thought it'd be helpful to outline and reiterate the most important steps to take for those that are maybe sort of earlier in their code journey. So step to take now, number one. We are thinking about the likely to be accessed by children question. So as Joe already mentioned, the scope of the code is around online services that are likely to be accessed by children. This was wording that was intentionally chosen by Parliament to ensure that the code didn't exclude services that children were widely using in reality. It's worth noting here that the onus really is on data controllers, to think about this. And if they don't believe they're likely to be accessed by children, they should really be able to sort of demonstrate that and demonstrate why they're consequently out of scope. And here the code says that online services should think about the nature of the content of the service and whether it's likely to appeal to children. And then also, secondly, how access measures online services might have in place are likely to impact on what age groups can access the service. So you need to think about these things, and to help you answer those kinds of questions and considerations, you have a wide range of tools at your disposal. So you could think about user testing, surveys with your existing users, perhaps look to sort of broader market research around what kinds of services children use, refer to academic or grey literature around what services might appeal to children. You have freedom to decide how to go about answering and evidencing the likely to be accessed question. The second step we recommend people take is to start the DPIA. As I've said, this is really, really important within the code. All online services are required to complete one. To get started on this, you'll obviously need to understand sort of where, the how, and the who of children's data processing. So you'll need a detailed data map. Alongside this, you'll also need to consider associated user journeys and data-related designs. This is all in the spirit of meeting the standards that I mentioned a second ago in that kind of service design bucket. And then once you've done that mapping, you'll then need to identify any risks associated with the map. So we've developed a children's code harms framework that helps services to think about risks in the context of the code, and I encourage you to take a look at that if that sounds helpful for you. The last thing I'll say on the DPIA front is we are publishing some sample DPIAs across 3 common code areas to show and bring to life what an effective code DPIA could look like. Last recommendation is around developing a transformation plan. So we obviously expect all services to demonstrate they're taking the code seriously, and this includes a thorough and clearly thought out plan. When developing this plan, it's important to have that sort of multidisciplinary group that span the 3 code areas that I talk about. So where possible, it'd be good to include, DPOs, public policy people, designers, engineers, etc. All of their expertise would be required, so it would be really helpful to have them in the room. Lastly, it's beneficial to bring children and parents with you also on this journey and with this transformation. So this is both to kind of communicate any changes in their user experience, but also to hopefully champion the good work you are doing to use children's data responsibly and meet the vision of the code. So I'll stop there and move us on to discussion. And I think Joe's going to kick us off with a few of your questions that you've helpfully submitted.
Yeah, Thanks, Jacob. I think just quite an easy one to start with, which was a question about whether or not the slides from this session will be available somewhere else. I think for this session they won't. The video will be available for a week on this platform. But having said that, we've got the Children's Code Hub resources on the ICO website, which brings together a whole raft of support that we've been developing for services, and on that you'll find some recordings of similar events to this one, sort of outlining the code. So I think that's a useful place for people to go to as a starting point. So hopefully that's helpful. I think another of the questions which I might ask at this point was how do you provide sort of privacy information for children in a way that they can understand? I don't know if you wanted to say some stuff about that, Jacob, just given your current focus on transparency.
Yeah, absolutely. So the code does itself sort of actually explicitly ask the question, how can we make sure that we meet the standard within the transparency standard? So it talks about providing clear privacy information. It talks about sort of providing bite-sized explanations at the point at which personal data is activated. It talks about sort of providing clear terms, policies, and community standards, tailoring your information to the age of the child. So, for example, perhaps including ability for a user to make an explanation more or less complex if they do want more or less information, things like that. So the starting point in the code is that it does give you those sort of overarching areas. We recognise that even within that, there might be more support that's helpful for people. So we actually recently, last week, concluded our Transparency Champions Open Call, and that was a call for online services and other stakeholders who are doing interesting things around designing children's privacy information to submit examples of good practice. We had some really, really good submissions. We're about to go through the sort of review process for them, and we're aiming to publish our learnings, which will be a sort of report highlighting interesting examples of transparency designs towards the end of the month / early June. So do keep an eye out for that one as well.
Great, thank you. And I think just within that question, the person who asked it was also focused on young children. And I think the only other thing I'd sort of add to it is I think we do recognise that there's still that role for parents to play. So within some of the information and some of the information that supports some of the sort of privacy settings and things as well, that we'd be encouraging where you're looking at children in the younger age spectrum to still look for them to seek advice from a trusted adult, a parent or a guardian. So I think that's still fine, and we recognise that sort of dual audience for those pieces of information. Just looking at another of the questions we've got, age appropriate design code, is that to cover children up to 16? So I think hopefully in some of the sort of opening remarks I made on some of my slides, it's actually everyone from under 18. So it's basically 0 to 17 that would be classed as a child for the purposes of the Children's Code. So that's its remit. Just looking again, we've got the ICO defines information society services as those normally provided for remuneration. Is it therefore unlikely to apply to public authorities who do not provide paid services to children? So I think it's normally for remuneration doesn't need to always mean that the remuneration is paid by the end user. So if you have remuneration involved with sort of advertising, that's going to count even if the end user isn't paying for that. But as far as public authorities is concerned, I think need to focus on whether or not that service is typically offered for remuneration or not, and focus on that. And if it isn't, it's less likely to be caught. I don't know if you had anything to add on that, Jacob.
Yeah, just to add a sort of link to wider data protection law and principles. I think as an example, if you're sort of relying on public task as the legal basis for your processing, then that's often a sort of good yardstick as to whether the sort of for remuneration question also applies. It's not sort of a perfect match, but that's another thing you can sort of consider when deciding.
Yeah. Great. And we've got, do we have to have a child-specific privacy policy? And I think we've sort of covered a bit about how you deal with transparency, but I think in most cases, yes, we would want to see privacy policies that cater to the needs of the age groups that your service is likely to be accessed by. That doesn't mean that you have to automatically cover and provide information for all of the age ranges from 0 to 17 if you don't think that particular groups are going to be accessing the service and you can evidence that, then there's no obligation to design for different age ranges that you don't think are actually likely to use the service. But for those that do, we'd want to see information and a privacy policy that does work for children of those ages. Just trying to go through a few more of these questions. Is there information on what needs to be included in a code-specific DPIA? So I think, as I mentioned, we've got the DPIA template at the back of the code, or at the end of the code in one of the annexes. So that sets out quite a lot of the points that need to be considered. We've also got some work that we've been doing. I don't know if you want to say some more on this, Jacob, but on a risk matrix that tries to help services to understand some of the risks involved.
Sure, yeah. So I think I touched upon it briefly at the end, but one aspect of that is the Children's Code Harms Framework. So we've published what we're sort of calling a beta version on our website already. We're sort of fine-tuning that following various sort of strands of engagement, and we'll be publishing that quite soon. So that framework helps online services to understand how different types of data processing might lead to different forms of harm that are relevant to the code and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Alongside that framework as well, we're also currently working hard to develop wider guidance that helps people to do the rest of that sort of best interests assessment, and then also use that best interest assessment to complete their DPIA and fulfill their other sort of data protection and code obligations as well. So the harms framework will be published slightly before that, but the overall overarching guidance should be available in sort of summertime.
Great, thank you. So just trying to go through some more questions here. We've answered that one. Are higher education institutions and universities required to comply with the code? I think we've got, I think that the services need to consider what they're doing, whether or not this is kind of core to the service that they're offering. And Jacob's already mentioned the points about public task, but I think there will be instances where, particularly if educational institutions are using third parties, where they will need to think about the code. But we are looking to delve a little bit deeper into some of the issues affecting the education sector. So I think it's probably best if we sort of hold that thought, and what if everybody keeps an eye on the Children's Hub. I think we will make some further information about the education context available as soon as we can, because we recognise some of the challenges in that. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Jacob. I think that's probably...
Yeah, just to say that the sort of underlying reason why this is such a knotty area is that in practice, so EdTech and then also, online services offered by other educational institutions aim to do quite different things and have quite different sort of business models. And so, for example, if you had an EdTech provider that was offered directly to children on a for-profit basis, that would definitely be in scope of the code. But then other areas where the business model is a bit more of a grey area and it's performing a sort of quasi-public task gets quite knotty, and it actually does depend on wider interpretation as defined by sort of case law around what an information society service looks like. So we just wanted to really take our time, ensure we really understand the case law, and ensure that we can give people as clear a steer on this as possible when we are able to. Yeah,
great. We've got a question here: should the code be implemented if an employer has an apprenticeship scheme in place? And I think we have had some questions about sort of services in a business environment, and I think the conclusion we reached on that was that if it was a sort of internal system, then that wasn't really the intent of the code to cover those sorts of instances. So I think obviously all services need to sort of think about their own particular context and have a look at the guidance, but I think generally in many of those sorts of instances we were saying that it was unlikely that the code would be relevant, though obviously when you are processing children's data you still got to kind of just consider the wider underlying data protection regime more generally. But I think it's probably quite unlikely in that instance that it's going to be relevant. Quite a few questions still looking through here. Should we always do a DPIA when processing involves children's data? So I think if you're within the scope of the code, then yes, you are required to do a DPIA. More generally, the ICO is also required to provide a list of the sort of circumstances in which data is considered to be data processing is considered to be high risk, and within the list that we've published, that does include children's data. So I think in many instances you're likely to need to do a DPIA, but I would recommend having a look both on the Children's Hub resources, but also on the ICA's wider guidance on GDPR generally, and particularly the sort of DPIA section of the guide to GDPR, and that might provide some further clarity on that front. I think we've got about five minutes left. It's quite long. So I think we've covered quite a lot of these. That. Does the code cover an online appointment booking system provided by a public authority for individuals aged 17 and over to attend a physical appointment with the public authority? Do you want to have a go at that one, Jacob, or do you want me to take that one?
I can certainly try. I think there's a couple of angles to this. So firstly, the exemption for counselling and preventative services. So presuming that sort of appointment booking system plays into a wider counselling or preventative survey, it wouldn't be in scope. Even if it wasn't sort of meeting that narrow definition, I think, as I've sort of mentioned, if it's a public task anyway, and it's a public task that isn't really offered by other bodies in this space on a for-profit basis, then that's also likely to be out of scope anyway. The last thing I'd say on that is if it's only accessed by individuals aged 17 and over, then that has sort of implications for what code measures would be required to conform anyway. So you wouldn't be expected to sort of redesign the service so that it could be used by a 6-year-old. And actually, in a lot of cases, the capabilities of a 17-year-old in terms of their media literacy and things like that would broadly match an adult anyway. So you would hope that there would be sort of not far-reaching changes that would be required, even if it did end up being in scope of the code.
Right. Okay, I think we've got one more, and it sort of builds really on that question. Are community clubs like Scouts and Brownies clubs impacted by the code as well? And I think, again, it sort of comes back to this point about whether or not the service that you're offering is completable in person without being in person or not. I think, based on my sort of limited understanding of Scouts from my son attending, I think it's possible that those sort of sites will probably be covered, because you'll be providing some information which isn't all connected with an in-person outcome. But I think we need probably a bit more about what those services are actually doing to reach a sort of a more formal view on it. But the likelihood is, I think, yeah, probably going to be, because certainly children are going to be trying to access those services. I think just trying to see if there's any more sort of short questions. I think, oh, there is one here about, does likely to be accessed by children mean that there's a sort of threshold, a sort of percentage or number of children covered before we would take it to be within the scope of the code? And I think we have had this question before, and the most we've been able to say is really that there has to be a more probable than not chance that a child will be interested, but we deliberately didn't sort of set a particular number or percentage threshold, because there were sort of views that would actually become quite difficult to be a sort of practical approach, really. So I think we haven't actually set a percentage number. We really just want to see how services work through that, what their evidence base is for why they think children will be interested in the service. Is there any way that they're restricted, which we've kind of covered already, but there is no percentage or minimum number. I think that's about all we've got time for. So I think, did we have a final slide with contact information and things? I think
we did.
Did you do that already? There we go. So just
text to catch up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is just as by way of closing, and thanks everybody for joining us today. But the further resources that you may want to refer to are listed here on the slide. So yeah, feel free to go to the ICO website, and particularly the Children's Hub, and to keep an eye on that as the transition period continues. We've got lots of resources on there already and are building on those. We've got a number of initiatives that Jacob's mentioned, like the transparency call, and some work with designers that we're to try and reach designers as well, to try and support that element of service providers. So it's quite an active set of resources, and just encourage people to engage with it regularly. And I think that's it. So thanks very much for joining us. Thanks, Jacob, and hope you enjoy the rest of the resources if you come back to the ICO platform to see anything that you've missed.